I'd like to welcome Professor Harvey Kaye, Professor Emeritus at University of Green Bay, Wisconsin, author of The Fight for Freedoms, What Made FDR and the Greatest Generation Great. Oh, a
Yep,
little
there you
bit
go.
too much light, but
Yeah, right.
I'm about two chapters into it, really good.
Oh,
Um,
great. Oh, so we're going to talk about that?
we're going to talk a little bit about that, and then I actually most of what this
That's
conversation is going to
yeah.
be
I'll,
centered
I'll
around.
I'll do this.
Oh, there it is. Yep,
For the
perfect.
fun of it, we'll switch the books on the shelf. How's that?
Perfect. Harvey's also the author of Thomas Paine and the Promise of America. Um, and your most recent work, I believe, is Take Hold of Our History, right?
Yeah, that was the book I originally had over my shoulder. It's
Oh,
which is a collection of my speeches and essays of the past 10 years. Not all of them, but it's a collection of the speeches and essays that I've done. So
sweet. Awesome. So, actually, and that is a lot of what we're going to get into the book because I feel like I haven't read Take Hold of Our History yet, but even in this book, The Fight for the Four Freedoms, it seems to be a sort of part of your work that the idea that we need to take our history back as the left. We need to remember who we are as a country. And so I want to sort of address some common right-wing fallacies that are sort of more it's easy for young people to digest because it's super simple, but it's also
yeah,
just completely wrong.
yeah.
So I want you to sort of be the debunk for like a lot of these right-wing historical inaccuracies essentially.
Okay. Well, let me. But I should make clear. I mean, the debunk is essential. Okay. But it's also the case that the debunk is not only against the right. In some ways, it's also a debunking amongst about the sort of liberals who, for
Yeah.
too long, ignored the the more critical question from the left, and that is, to what extent the 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 greatest generation was not simply the generation that fought World War II, but also quite arguably the most progressive generation in American history, or at least in the 20th century, for the ways in which they transformed America in response to FDR's call for a New Deal. And that transformation extends not only through the 1930s into World War II years, but in its own way, for all their faults and failings, all the way through to the early 1970s. So I really think that I was writing as much against the liberal ignoring of the past as the right wing effort to hijack the past. How's that?
It's very good, very well put.
Okay.
So this is gonna be probably the easiest one. This is just one that I need a teacher to sort of break this down and put it in a way that I may not be able to. So this is this is an example that I hear a lot from younger right wingers who sort of just are kind of influenced by their parents. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, sure.
And so they'll say, and they're big Trump fans, and I'm sure they get called racist, or they feel like people are labeling them that as that. And what they say to me is, well, you know, Lincoln and the Republicans freed the slaves, so they can't be a racist party. So I want you to just sort of, it's yeah, wow,
Yeah, no, it's both true and false, but go ahead.
right. So I want you to sort of break down the ideology behind the radical Republicans, and then maybe introduce us to the philosophy of like the old school La Follette Republicans as well, and then how the
Oh, I know
party.
wait, you're piling on a little bit. Let's start with the Lincoln story.
Okay, yeah, let's start with that.
Okay, let's start with Lincoln story. First start, Lincoln was decidedly against slavery. And I think it's a myth that he was a racist. Okay, that's a myth. That's a myth that people on the left have allowed themselves also to buy into. Okay, but at the same time, while Lincoln was portrayed by generations as the great emancipator for signing the Emancipation Proclamation and for pursuing the end of slavery, we shouldn't forget that the way in which he was able to do that was, first of all, that the southern states, the white supremacists in the South, split from the Union, because as much as Lincoln wanted to end slavery, as much as he wanted to do it, he couldn't do it until he had the, if you like, the power and authority to do it. And even then, when they split, the authority that he used to sign the Emancipation Proclamation was the authority afforded as commander-in-chief during the war. Okay, and because in fact, he only, in essence, signed the Emancipation Proclamation liberating the slaves in the states that had seceded, not the border states themselves, not the border states. But the other thing, and this is really important, is what empowered him to do it wasn't simply that the Confederacy seceded. It was also the fact that African-American slaves, in their hundreds and thousands and even tens of thousands, left their plantations during the course of the war to make their way as quickly as they could to the Union lines. And especially in the case of the men, but the women too, presumably, were asking to be in some ways enlisted into the war effort against the white slaveholders in the South. And by the way, that they already had enlisted African-American troops in the North in the effort. And basically by the end of the war, I believe 250,000 men in the Union Army were themselves men of color. So it isn't just that slaves emancipated themselves. It did require, I mean, Lincoln, it's a kind of dialectic, you might say, Lincoln and the slaves. So okay. And then of course, the radical Republicans, who are significant, especially because they would have liked to have really dispossessed the slaveholders in the South, just literally carried out land reform in the South. And Reconstruction was an important part of that. They never really did get to carry out the kinds of radical changes that they envisioned. But those who in the late 20th century into the 21st century who say, how can Republicans be racist? It's a Republican Party initiative that, emancipated the slaves. Well, it's interesting, if you look over the many years, the Republican Party has literally turned its back on the Lincoln tradition for generations. So much so, by the way, and this can segue us a bit into the Roosevelt years, is that in 1930 or 31, I guess it was, Roosevelt said to a major historian who had written quite a bit on Jefferson and Hamilton and all of that. It was considered one of the sort of Democratic Party intellectuals of around the early 1930s. And Roosevelt wrote to him and said, basically, the Democratic Party can lay claim to Jefferson, but we ought to really lay claim to Lincoln too, since the Republicans have abandoned him. Now, it's important to realize that the Southern states were, during the 20th century, well, ever since mid-19th, were states dominated by Democratic Party regimes, white supremacist Democratic Party regimes. But it is also the case that Roosevelt was eager to lay claim to Lincoln in part because of the fact that in his own way, he did want to sort of nudge the Democratic Party away from that kind of segregationist tradition. It was very hard to do that, however, because of the fact that he really did need the Southern votes in Congress, because we shouldn't forget, committees in Congress are organized by seniority. So the House members and Senate members who are there the longest are the ones who get to chair the committees. And in the South, the Democratic Party was so strong, they really ran one-party governments in the South. And in that sense, if you were elected to the Senate, you could spend the rest of your life in the Senate without any real challenge. So as a consequence, Southern senators chaired the committees that FDR needed approval from to pass so much of the New Deal legislation. And the New Deal legislation did not contain racism, in the sense that under the 14th Amendment, you couldn't legislate racially.
Right.
So what Southern senators did is they legislated occupationally.
Mm.
So they excluded agricultural workers from both Social Security and the rights of labor to organize and bargain collectively. I mean, it was the case that it didn't exclude by race, it excluded by occupations. Similarly, household workers were left out of Social Security, which, by the way, also affected in parts of the country Irish Americans who themselves had been for many years household workers in the North, in New England states. And similarly, excluding agricultural workers not only excluded Blacks in the South, it also excluded Mexican American agricultural workers in the
Yeah.
Southwest. So anyhow, that's just as a point to all of this. So your friends who tell you, well, how could Republicans be considered racist? Well, let's put it this way: there are plenty of racists to go around, both on the in the Democratic Party and the
Yeah.
Republican Party. But the Republican Party for some time now has really had a monopoly over questions of race and racism, which is really tragic to say, but that is the case. And if Lincoln were alive today, I have little hesitation in saying he might well be a Democrat. He decidedly would not be a Republican.
Right.
And in fact, he would likely find the Democratic Party much too moderate, much too
Yeah.
centrist, because Abraham Lincoln, I haven't written a book on Lincoln myself yet, though I've often thought I've written little pieces, but Lincoln was really what you would call a proto-social democrat, meaning he's kind of like one of the earliest of social democratic political figures in American history. If you like, I can explain what that means for anyone listening. It's
Yeah,
the
sure. Go
fact that
ahead.
he signed into law, let's start with the fact that Bernie Sanders called for free public higher education,
Yeah.
which was not all that radical idea since state universities had historically had very low tuition. In some states, free tuition at public universities. All you had to do was pay student fees, okay?
Yeah.
So where does that come from? Well, back in 1862, Lincoln signed into law the Morrill Act, which is called the Land Grant Act, which gave each of the states a certain amount of land, which they could then turn into resources to create, which they were intended to create public, that is, state universities. So in every state, there are now land grant universities. In Wisconsin, it's the University of Wisconsin. In Minnesota, it's probably the Minnesota State University System or the University of Minnesota. I'm not quite sure which that would be, but it's probably University of Minnesota, but I really don't know for a fact. And I'm saying that because you're in Minnesota.
Right.
So
Yeah.
the thing is, for a start, he actually envisioned essentially very low cost state or public higher education. This is Lincoln, the sort of like the advanced guard of 20th century FDR social democracy. Similarly, the Homestead Act, and there are any number of things that Lincoln signed into law because he believed that we create government to do for ourselves what we cannot do on our own. And that's a very social democratic ideal of how to improve the public good, how to enhance democracy. So there you go.
Awesome. So how could you go into sort of the Midwest early 19th or early 20th century Republicans, like,
Oh, the progressive Republicans.
yeah, the progressive Republicans, probably more during, I suppose, like Theodore Roosevelt's time, or even a little bit later than that. And
well, let's talk Wisconsin. I think, did you
okay, yeah,
mention
yeah,
it? Let's
perfect.
talk Wisconsin, your neighboring state. So Robert La Follette, Sr., that is, Robert La Follette, who was a member of the Republican Party, was frustrated as hell by the fact that the Republicans really were in bed with big business, the railway companies and the banks and so on. And he was outraged by the fact that the Republican Party seemed more committed to advancing the interests of capital rather than the interests of ordinary citizens and working people. So he literally, in essence, he kind of bolts from the Republican Party in favor of what we call capital P, progressivism. Because it isn't just that they were promoting the interests, he actually was convinced that the Republican Party was corrupt and that they were in the, basically being bought off by railroads and other big businesses. So the Progressive Party was intended to be a reform party to make democracy answer to the will of the people. This was at the same time, and this is really important, the progressives, capital P, and the socialists, capital S, emerge at the same time as two significant forces in American public life. And of course, the progressives are a far more effective force in one sense, because they actually did, they elected people to office. And in fact, in 1912, which is a remarkable political year, election year, you had four major candidates running for president. So you had Howard Taft, the incumbent Republican, who was a conservative Republican. You had Teddy Roosevelt, who had been president as a progressive Republican and was now running as a progressive, capital P. It was called the Bull Moose Party. And then you had Woodrow Wilson as a Democrat. And let's make it clear, in his day, a lot of people saw Wilson as a capital P progressive, but he was a racist. Okay, he came out of Virginia. He made his political career in New Jersey, having been the president of Princeton University. And it was the longstanding joke was that Princeton University was the northernmost university of the South. Okay, maybe that was because of the racism that prevailed there, and most especially the fact that Wilson himself was the president of the university. And the fourth candidate, one of my heroes, was Eugene Debs,
Yep.
who began really as a great railway workers union leader, okay, and was imprisoned because of the railway strike of 1894, if I'm not mistaken. But the point is, he comes out of prison all the more radicalized. Okay, not only is his earlier heroes still his heroes, Patrick Henry and Thomas Paine, but he's also now a socialist when he emerges from prison. And he becomes in time the leading figure of the Socialist Party in the United States. And in 1912, he runs as the socialist candidate for president. And they garnered, I think it was 900,000 votes. I could be wrong, but it was a really important force. And the curious thing is, it wasn't only an important force, say, among working class folk in the cities, okay, and like Milwaukee or Chicago and other places. It was actually also a significant force in rural areas at the time as well. There were vast followings of the socialists in places like Oklahoma and Texas and Kansas. So what had happened was the populists of the 1890s had basically failed to win the major election of 1896, was it, with William Jennings Bryan, who ran on the Democratic and populist ticket as a candidate of both parties. And so the Populist Party had been running out of steam, and those rural workers and family farmers who really were looking for a new political home, many of them found it in the Socialist Party. So the thing is, Wisconsin becomes a very interesting political laboratory in a way, because you've got this family, the La Follette family, who are, truly progressives out of the Republican Party. And then in certain parts of the state, most especially in Milwaukee, you get the emergence of socialist politics. And for good parts of the 20th century, the mayor of Milwaukee was a socialist. In fact, I knew the last socialist mayor of Milwaukee. He was no longer mayor, but he was still very much a socialist. And then the other thing is that even up here in Northeast Wisconsin, which is a seemingly more conservative part of the state, there were serious Socialist Party chapters. I don't know if people remember the name because most of your viewers might well be young, but there was a great American poet in the 20th century who also wrote a famous set of biographies of Lincoln, named Carl Sandburg. I mean, Sandburg was just a phenomenal figure. And he's often associated with his poetry about Chicago and the great shoulders of the Chicago skyscrapers, I think, something along those lines. But the fact is, his political career really began in Wisconsin. He was a socialist organizer here in Northeast Wisconsin.
Mm.
And then he was the aide, the right-hand man to the head of the Socialist Party, who I think then became mayor of Milwaukee, I mean. So the Midwest actually had a remarkable tradition of progressive politics and socialist politics. And then in your own state of Minnesota, of course, you get the creation of the Farm Labor Party,
Yep.
which later
Democratic
does
farmer.
merge with the Democrats to become the DFL.
Right.
And over in North Dakota, which is now this, very conservative state,
Yep.
they had the, I just blanked on the name of it. I blanked. It was a similar kind of thing to the progressives, the populists, the socialists, and the Farm Labor Party. Help me out.
I believe it was a sort of coalition of like a lot of the smaller third parties that were more labor
But the
base.
nonpartisan league, I think, was the force.
That
That was
that
the
sounds right.
coalition, that force. And they created, to my knowledge, I think the first state bank, as opposed to, they
Yep.
wouldn't, they were so outraged by banking practices. And the state bank, I believe, still exists in North Dakota,
Yep.
though North Dakota has become nothing
But
of the
yeah,
sort of kind of left, progressive politics of the past. But there were these forces, and many a city in the Midwest actually had socialists and progressives in their city councils, running for office. Anyhow, so does that get it, the kinds of things you're interested in?
that was really good. And one thing I do want to hit on this show generally is that the Midwest does have a populist socialist tradition and a
Right.
very progressive tradition. And it is only, sort of recently that it's developed this very, in deindustrialized areas where a lot of people turn to Trump. That's and even before that, sort of, I think the destruction of labor unions has sort of led to more of these deindustrialized areas becoming more disorganized, and then they sort of fall into the right wing trap in many ways.
Yeah, in fact, can I just, let me,
Yep.
Grady, I'll just point out two things. First of all, the foremost socialist newspaper, which had a huge subscribers, all, subscribing all across the country, huge numbers, was actually printed in Girard, Kansas. Okay.
Wow.
I think his name, I think it was Julius Wayland. I mean, it's really remarkable kind of newspaper. Just, it was all over the country. Came out of Girard, Kansas. That was where they were being. That's where they were publishing. The other thing I want to point out is in your state of Minnesota. Now, you're up north in Bemidji.
Yep.
Hope I'm not giving anything away. But
Nope,
if you
you're
go to
good.
the Iron Range of
Yep.
Minnesota, the unionism there, I mean, it was radical. And the Iron Range back in the 30s, I believe it was, sent a communist congressman to
Wow.
uh, Bertrand, I'm forgetting the name exactly. And here over in Wisconsin, to the north of Wisconsin, is the Upper Peninsula of
Upper
Michigan,
Peninsula, which is a very left
which
wing
was
sort of.
historically, which is now major Trump territory, but in
Yep.
its day, Italian workers, Finnish
Yep.
workers, and Cornish workers were very progressive, especially the Finns and to some extent the Italians with them, organizing their unions, quite a big socialist following, very progressive areas. And then, of course, what to come back to your point about the deindustrialization, it's not just the deindustrialization, of course, it's also these trade deals like
Yep.
NAFTA, which
Yep.
really sort of devastate the industrialism of the upper Midwest.
Right.
And and in that sense, what's really tragic is that it didn't have to happen that way. But the Democrats really turned their backs. I mean, this is the harsh reality is the Democrats, starting in the 70s and most decidedly under the Clinton, well,
Yep.
the Bill Clinton, but Hillary was, very much a partner in that presidency, and then thought she was entitled to run for president later.
Yep.
It's the case that the Democrats turned their backs on working people. So believe me, it isn't that the working people in the upper Midwest became Republican. They just became angry.
Yeah.
And in 2016, to jump ahead a bit, in 2016, I have little doubt in my mind that if Bernie Sanders had been the Democratic candidate the Democratic candidate for president, he would have won.
Right.
People turned to Trump out of anger. They would have turned to Bernie out of anger and hope,
Oh. Yep.
okay, and possibilities, because he outlined serious initiatives to address the inequality, to afford real opportunities for young people to go to university, to
Yep.
allow families to not be, afraid of anyone in the family getting sick, and by creating Medicare for all. I mean, we could just lay out all of the initiatives, and we would have seen a different story of these last number of years, instead of the neoliberalism of the Carter administration, of the Clinton administration, and frankly, and people don't want to confess to this or admit to this, of the Obama years.
Yep.
So, there you go.
So Martin Luther King Day is coming up.
Right.
Um,
Tomorrow, I guess, from where right, this is
yep.
Sunday, tomorrow's would be,
Yep.
yep,
Tomorrow.
yeah.
By the time this interview completely airs, this will be after Martin Luther King Day, but I do want to upload something for Martin Luther King Day. So I want to just first make the point that in his own words, MLK Jr. was a socialist, was a
Yeah,
democratic socialist
right.
specifically.
Yeah,
Um, so in any way you can just kind of take this wherever you want. Please speak to MLK and his radicalism and his belief in not only racial equality but economic equality as well.
yeah. Thank you. Okay, for a start, MLK's father, Martin Luther King Sr., okay, who was a minister as well in Atlanta, that's where it begins, was very much a Roosevelt Democrat. And let's make it clear, Roosevelt he didn't use the term, his term for what he was a liberal, as he put it, left of center. But he was a social democrat. The whole new look, the creation of Social Security, the signing of the National Labor Relations Act, the creation of the Rural Electrification Agency. I mean, on and on and on. You can go all the way through the New Deal years. The engagement and the empowerment of workers. Roosevelt, by any standard, would have to have been dubbed in his day a social democrat. And he actually would quote Lincoln's idea of government to explain his own idea of government, that we create government to do for ourselves what we cannot do by ourselves. Okay. So Martin Luther King was a very bright young guy, and he ended up going to college. It was Morehouse College in Atlanta when he was only a teenager. I think he might have entered college at 15. And while he was there, he was very much, yeah, 15. He was very much influenced by, first of all, his father, who was very, very much a supporter of Franklin Roosevelt. But he was also very much by, and I'm forgetting his name, by the head of the president of Morehouse College, who was very much a sort of active civil rights, social democratic kind of thinker. But the other thing is, and this is not often recognized, is that I think it was in 1944, no later than 45, that A. Philip Randolph, America's leading Black labor leader of the 20th century, who headed the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters and was himself a socialist, very important, and the same man who launches the March on Washington movement in 1941 after he hears Roosevelt's speech for the four freedoms: freedom of speech, freedom of worship, freedom from want, and freedom from fear. And that's that same movement and that same man who was really the, if you like, the godfather or the figure who creates the March on Washington movement of 1963,
Mm.
which
Could we
he and
just
Bayard
just
Rustin.
just a real quick,
Sorry.
could we the next time we do an interview, could we do a whole conversation about A. Philip Randolph, because I feel like he's one of the most underserved figures on the left and in history in general, and he's extremely important. But yeah,
Yeah, I think we could, but I don't know. I mean, I don't know if I'm the person you want to talk to for a full half hour even on A. Philip Randolph, but I can talk about him, and I'll just point it out to people now. So, with the assistance of Bayard Rustin and also the direct assistance of Walter Reuther, who was the head of the United Auto Workers, who was also historically a socialist, they create the March on Washington movement and recreate it. And in August, late July or August of 63, there is the famous March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, at which Martin Luther King Jr. gives his famous speech, I have a dream. But I want to go back again to explain the connection. So Randolph came to the college, Morehouse College, to speak, invited by the president of the college, while King was a student. And he didn't just speak for one day. I believe he was there for several days, meeting with the students and talking. And it's pretty clear from the biographies that I've read of King that was very influential in King's thinking. That may even have made him it may well have turned him into the democratic socialist he later is evident. Now, and the other thing about it, and you're absolutely right, King believed he was not only a civil rights leader, and that's crucial to recognize, but at the same time, he believed fundamentally in the imperative for civil rights and the labor movement to be united. And in some ways they were, and in some ways they tragically were not. But let's not forget, there were Black unions, like such as A. Philip Randolph's, also unions that really worked in the sort of commercial sector. There were unions that in spite of all the racism that prevailed in certain sectors of the labor movement, there were also integrated unions. International Ladies Garment Workers Union, and others. So King himself is a civil rights leader, and in his own way, he actually becomes a voice of labor, not just through the many years he's speaking on behalf of civil rights, calling on labor to unite, but also let's not forget that his final campaign as such is in 1968 in Memphis. And he was there because of Black sanitation workers who were on strike. I mean, people who had really endured terrible conditions of employment and had gotten to the point where they were organizing and they were demanding recognition and they were demanding decency. And he was there, right, to join, to be in solidarity with them. And that's where he was assassinated. So you might say, to the end, he was very much committed to civil rights and to labor, and labor, both black and white, but on that occasion, it was black workers. So yeah, democratic socialists, absolutely. Again, the term I kind of like for all of these is, these people we're talking about, is sort of social democracy. I think it's unfortunate. I mean, Bernie was really running both times as a sort of 21st century version of FDR's New Deal Democrat.
Right, and you've made that
and I
case
don't
that
deny.
maybe he should have connected it more to social democracy and America's own history of radicalism rather than, which he did more in 2020, but
Yeah, which,
rather
by the
than
way,
the
if you know my,
Scandinavia socialist example.
yeah, right, which has been my argument from the beginning. Look, I mean, I happen to be still a member of DSA, so I don't run from the idea of democratic socialists. But if you're going to try to talk in the American tradition on the and talk about the sort of the broad scope of social democratic politics, Bernie could easily have done. They would have still called him a socialist. That's not, but which he is. But the fact was, if he was going to try to create that broad left politics, it might have been good if he didn't have to constantly explain what it meant to be a democratic socialist and just talked about being a social democrat. A lot of my friends say, Harvey, you're wrong. He had to come out and do it. But people I've spoken to, older than myself, always say to me, if you have to explain what you mean by the word, you're spending too much time. You're wasting too much time. Just push the thing that people can immediately more readily relate to. So anyhow,
I think Bernie using the word democratic socialism was good for the socialist movement, but it was probably bad for the Bernie movement in
that's
some
a good way of
ways,
putting it. I think you might be, well, it might well be, that's a good way of putting it, definitely.
because it's allowed people like me and other young people to be open to saying the word socialism and being, reading socialist uh, literature and stuff like that.
Yeah.
But at the same time, the big problem with the Bernie campaign is older voters. Really, I mean, older voters were the least likely to vote for Sanders, and I think you can definitely make the case that socialist label is part of the reason.
Yeah, I mean, the American socialist tradition, let's think about it for the moment as the American social democratic tradition. I mean, it's so rich and so great that Bernie failed himself by not grabbing hold of it. So, I mean, social democracy as a modern idea, because it wouldn't have existed before then, really goes all the way back even to my actual hero, Thomas Paine, and who was the great revolutionary who wrote the pamphlet Common Sense that turned the American Revolution from a rebellion, a colonial rebellion, into a world historic revolution, not simply for independence, but indeed for a democratic republic. And later, among Paine's important writings is a work called Agrarian Justice, and similarly, Rights of Men. And there he's really laying out the ideals and ideas of social democracy to the point where he is actually the godfather of the whole idea of social security, which I don't have to necessarily get into now. But if you think about Paine, and then you think about the labor movement of the 19th century, you think about Abraham Lincoln, who I've already explained is a kind of proto, a social democrat in the making, and maybe he's just straight out a social democrat, to be fair. And then you come into the 20th century, you've got Debs, you've got a host of women inside the labor movement who are advancing social democratic ideals, Eleanor Roosevelt, Franklin Roosevelt, and Walter Reuther, the great American labor leader, Martin Luther King, the great civil rights and labor leader, A. Philip Randolph, again, great labor and civil rights leader. I mean, just come right along. It's an incredibly rich tradition. And I've left out a hell of a lot of people in that, even in that roster.
So So why do you think right-wing figures like you, one example you use a lot is like Ronald Reagan, taking from FDR and taking from Thomas Paine, and why do you
Yeah.
think right-wing figures try to appropriate these sort of radical figures that if they probably weren't really aligned with if they were in the same era?
Yeah. Well, the first thing to consider is the fact that Republicans, not currently, nowadays, American politics is so screwed up, but the Republican Party was in almost a minority party. I mean, they were, maybe they were destined for the, the dung heap of history, you could say, because who are they going to appeal to if they're conservatives, if they don't believe in the powers of government being harnessed for the public good, if they were totally incapable of appealing any longer to people of color? I mean, where were they going to go? So here's the thing. Roosevelt created in the 1930s the New Deal and led Americans to World War II. And he did this as a social democrat, small s and small d, okay? And the social democratic ideals, which were embodied in the Four Freedoms, which is really the theme of the struggles that made FDR and the Greatest Generation truly great, is basically, the Republican Party, the only way in which they're continuing to survive after FDR's presidency is they realize that there are certain things they can't do. So in the 1950s, when Eisenhower becomes president, conservatives and the billionaire or multimillionaire conservatives kept pressing him to start acting like a real conservative. And what did that mean? They wanted him to go after Social Security. They wanted him to go after labor law. They wanted him to go after subsidies to farmers. All the things that FDR had enacted with the Democratic New Dealers in the 1930s, these conservatives wanted to take America back to the 1920s, or maybe even further back. Okay, they were not the party of Lincoln any longer, because FDR basically had put together this strange bedfellows coalition of Northern blacks, Northern ethnics, not simply Protestants, but Catholics and Jews. Okay, in certain areas of the country, farmers, the labor movement, and oddly enough, and this is the weird part, they still had the Southern Democrats. But in the 1950s, conservatives said, hey, in fact, Eisenhower had two brothers, a liberal brother and a conservative brother. And the conservative brother was sending him letters saying, when are you going to start acting like the conservative? Look, these people put you in power. This is, the opportunity. And he wrote back to his brother a great letter. It's in the book, by the way. And he says, my chair is falling a bit. That's why I keep moving around. I apologize. So he writes to his brother, and he said, I think his brother was named Edgar, something like that. And he says, you've got to be kidding. Any party that wants to undo labor law, that wants to undo Social Security, that wants to undo subsidies to farm, lays it all out. He says, any party that wants to go after the New Deal legacy will never be heard from again in this country. And he said that. And so he knew. Now, why did he know that? He wasn't just smart. He might well have run for the presidency as a Democrat at some point. In fact, they were pressing him from both sides, run as a Republican, run as a Democrat. It's also the case that he had led. Yeah, he had led. Truman actually at one point thought he would make for the next great president. So here's the funny part. Not funny part. This is an important thing. Eisenhower was the commander of American forces, Allied forces in Europe during World War II. He knew what his men wanted after the war. They wanted things like the New Deal. So he was smart enough to know you don't go after the Roosevelt legacy, because that legacy is the legacy of the Greatest Generation. They put Roosevelt in power. They created the labor movement. They did all of those things. It wasn't just FDR, doing it. His own press secretary, one Sunday afternoon, they were taking a stroll, reports that Eisenhower had said to him, the Republicans need a more liberal platform if we're going to be really effective. It's this kind of thing where, the Republicans, smart Republicans, knew what needed doing. But anyhow, in the 60s, the right wing of the Republican Party takes charge of the party under Goldwater, first of all. And then some years later, Reagan, who had literally aligned himself with Goldwater at the time, he emerges in that party. This is, of course, in the wake of the Great Society and if you like, the Johnson administration. Nixon himself was a conservative, but he didn't pursue conservative policy. I mean, he was a reactionary in some ways, but he knew that he could not go after the New Deal legacy. You know, he just knew it. So he actually signs into law things that generally are associated with the Democratic Party, like Environmental Protection Agency, Occupational Safety and Health Administration. He actually proposed national health care at one point, Nixon. He even proposed a minimum family income. I mean, it was, he didn't care much about domestic policy, one could say, but the point was he knew enough that you don't go after the New Deal legacy. Unfortunately, the guy who the Democrats choose in 76, Jimmy Carter, he had no affection. His family had no affection for the New Deal. He was a Southern Democrat.
Democrat, yeah.
Okay. He pretended to be a liberal when he ran in 76. And in the course of his one-term presidency, he literally begins the unraveling of the New Deal. So he begins the deregulation of finance, the deregulation of certain industrial sectors. He refuses to empower labor when labor is on the verge of getting a new labor law reform to make it easier to organize. I mean, Carter begins in many ways the neoliberalism and paves the way for Reagan. Now, Reagan is smart. Now I'm going to answer your question.
Yep.
Reagan is smart. So when he runs for president in 1979 and 80, he knows that the Republicans have they're limited in their following, though he also knows that Carter has so messed things up that he has a real chance to win the presidency because the economy was not, it was a period of what's known as stagflation, stagnant economy and inflation, which were not supposed to happen at the same time. So what does Reagan do? He runs for president, you know, as this kind of as a new right figure. He's putting together a coalition. And at the Republican National Convention, knowing that if you've won the nomination, you don't have to appeal to your party. You have to appeal beyond your party on national TV. And what does he do in his acceptance speech? He quotes Thomas Paine, Abraham Lincoln, and Franklin Roosevelt. So he quotes the American revolutionary. He quotes the great Republican reformer. Okay, in some ways, revolutionary is what Lincoln was. And then he quotes Franklin Roosevelt, the great New Deal social democratic liberal. And what does he quotes? Thomas Paine, and he's, you know, basically says, we have it in our, in fact, he actually uses that line, we have it in our power to begin the world over again, my God. And then with Roosevelt, he quotes Roosevelt completely out of context. But the point is, George Will, the foremost conservative columnist, Washington Post and Newsweek magazine, I think it was, he's basically outraged. He said, what is this? You know, we've nominated a conservative finally, and we're going, we're going to go for the president. Well, not finally, there was Goldwater before him. And he's quoting these leftists basically, right? I mean, this, basically he's supposed to quote Edmund Burke, the great English, Anglo-Irish, conservative. So nevertheless, what was Reagan doing? He was trying to appeal to the old Roosevelt Democrats, trying to appeal to working people who had heroes like Paine, Lincoln, and FDR. So the Republicans got smart and Reagan led the way. Hijack history, lay claim to the past, rewrite the American story, the American narrative. And Reagan did it over and over again. And all the way through, Republicans have laid claim to the past. Now, what have the Democrats done? They've run away from the past. Okay, they've run away from it, right? So, we've ended up with some pretty abysmal Democratic candidates and pretty mediocre Democratic leaders, capital D Democratic leaders.
So yeah, I guess your point is then when the left runs away from its territory, when it runs away from its own history, the right is gonna appropriate it, it's gonna cultivate it and try to make it fit its own narrative.
The American story is undeniably a story filled
Uh-oh.
all men are created equal, and then life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That's a phenomenal American promise.
Mhm.
And Roosevelt recognized it himself. He said in 1932, when he was running for president, he said, you know, we've allowed corporate leaders to become titans of industry. The promise of the Declaration is under siege because of the power and wealth accumulated. He didn't use the term, but we can readily say capitalists. And what did he say, Roosevelt? He said, look, let's go back to the Declaration. Let's go back to the promise of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. What do you need for life? Well, you need a good job. You need an income to support your family. You need these things. Liberty, look, he repeated this throughout his presidency. Needy men, he should have said men and women, but he said men. Needy men are not free men. And then he said pursuit of happiness. My goodness, I mean, the pursuit of happiness requires resources. It requires opportunities. So what did he do? Roosevelt went back and grabbed hold of that promise and gives it a social democratic imperative, which then gets elected, and he pursues it. And then he announces the Four Freedoms in 1941 to remind Americans of who they are and what the threat of fascism represents. And then in 1944, in the State of the Union address, he calls for an economic Bill of Rights for all Americans. And he does so, basically when he does these speeches, he does so speaking of what the American story is about, what it means to be an American. And Democrats have turned their backs on that story. Maybe they're afraid of that story for two
Yeah.
possible reasons. Maybe on the one hand, they don't want to talk about empowering working people. Okay,
Yeah.
they don't want to do it. Okay, I'll tell you a quick story about Bill Clinton when he was running for president in 1992.
Yep.
He tried to lay claim to Thomas Jefferson. Great, right? Great. Although Jefferson, the slaveholder, is not the one anyone would have wanted to lay claim to. But he's
Yeah.
talking about Jefferson, the radical Democrat, the author of the Declaration and all of that. Well, think about this. Think about this. What William Jefferson Clinton, Jefferson being Bill Clinton's middle name, said over and over was, well, just as Thomas Jefferson said, right? In every generation, Americans will need change, except that's not what Jefferson said. What Jefferson said was, in every generation, Americans will need some rebellion,
Yeah.
meaning that there'll have to be this impulse towards some kind of political democratic, small d democratic action. So why did he not use the original term? Maybe because he didn't want to rile Americans up to start making demands.
Mm-hmm.
And then, by the way, his own presidency showed how much he was willing to turn his back on working people. But then here's another possibility. For so many years, what we've done when we've told the American story is we've focused on the exploitation and the oppression. And as a consequence, to talk about the past and to talk about the American story as a story of struggle and progress, maybe the Democrats are afraid that somebody will accuse them of ignoring the tragedies, so they run from it. To quote Jefferson, you can imagine immediately someone saying, oh no, Jefferson was a slaveholder, right? You quote Lincoln, they'll say, oh, but Lincoln, he was prepared to save the Union even if slavery survived. Well, look more closely at the story. That's all I can tell you. Okay.
Wonderful. And also another thing that may be tougher, like the right instinctively knows, I think, that a lot of our figures, I guess, that would maybe be on the more social democratic side are popular, and the things that they propose are very popular, and that's
Right.
why they try and lay claim to them. It's hard for us to be like, oh yeah, like I think the only example of liberals or people on the center left adopting a reactionary figure is Alexander Hamilton because of the Broadway play. It's like, oh, they're
Yeah. Right.
rapping Alexander Hamilton. He's so cool. Like,
Yeah. I wish.
Happened.
I was told by someone that I shouldn't be too upset with Lin-Manuel Miranda for promoting Alexander Hamilton because, Lin-Manuel Miranda and Alex really liked him because he was a figure from the Caribbean, and that would have given him an additional reason to do so. The sad thing is that when the New York Times Book Review asked Lin-Manuel Miranda what book every American should read, he said Common Sense by Thomas Paine. And I was, oh, geez, too bad he didn't do a musical on Thomas Paine, right?
Right. Like, and that would be such a it'd be a much better story, probably, first of all. You wouldn't have to sort of brush over so many things, I don't think. I think, like, I've
Well,
listened
think
to
of the
that.
tragedy. Yeah.
y- Go ahead.
Yeah. Think of how sad it is that there's no statue of Thomas Paine on the National Mall in Washington, D.C. The radical, the revolutionary, okay,
Right.
whose line, again, we have it in our power to begin the world over again, is really the most revolutionary line in modern history. And it's told in various forms in later generations, whether it's Karl Marx or Franklin Roosevelt, others rephrased it for their times. But that in many ways is the begin. In some ways, I don't want to get, I mean, Paine's my hero, so I tend to get
Right.
carried
Yeah.
away, but when Paine wrote that line, he began really the modern age.
Hmm.
I mean, that's the moment, and it incited not just more rebellion; it incited a revolution in America. For all of the things it left undone.
It seems like Paine, in many ways, Paine was sort of a vision of, like, if there ever is like a sort of humane capitalism, he was sort of the visionary, the early visionary for a very democratic, a very
Yeah,
worker
right.
oriented sort, and masses oriented more than worker, even like just masses in general.
Well, yeah, yeah. Although we shouldn't forget that he himself, in contrast to the other founders, um, as an adult, was really a working man.
Hmm.
Okay, I mean, he'd been trained as an artisan corset maker. In fact, oddly enough,
Yep.
he had sailed on a privateer, which was a ships that were licensed to sail and attack enemy shipping. He had served actually in the British civil service. He was an excise officer. He was a customs officer, and he was fired from that job because he became the spokesperson for demanding higher wages for the excise officers. So his first, he can't. What drove him to America was the fact that he gotten fired for labor activism, you might say, and Ben Franklin, who liked him a great deal, said, "You should go to America. Now's the time. Go to America." And he was already 37 years of age. So anyhow, there you go.
Awesome. Real quick, this can be very short. Just quick thoughts on what you thought of the Biden proposal. The recent proposal you rolled out, $15 minimum wage was in there, $1,400 checks, which is sort of a you know, it's 2,000, but
Right. But
what do
let's
you
put it
what do you
this
think
way.
of that? Because I thought, I was very
Somebody
surprised
asked
by
me, right.
how good it
Somebody
was.
asked me. Yeah, somebody asked me to, let's start off with the crudest version of what did I think of it. Somebody asked me, rank it on a scale of 1 to 10, right? 10 the highest. And I was being generous. I said 7. Okay. I said
Okay.
7. Okay. And the reason is that, the $15 minimum wage is good, but not good enough.
Right.
Okay, the $1,400. Yeah, you could say, well, we already received 600, so it really does total 2,000. But they said the checks would be 2,000.
2,000. Yes,
That's
they
what they
did.
said. Okay. So the 600 that they just authorized, not they, but that the Trump administration authorized before, that's the Trump legacy.
Right.
Biden should have started out then with the new leg. Okay. I think let's put it this way, it's a good start for Biden,
Hmm.
but it's inadequate as a way of going forward. I'm really, really interested in what he has to say in the inaugural address. I don't expect him to lay out a new deal necessarily, but I can tell you, we should listen carefully. He will signal to us what we should expect. And it may well piss me off. It may well excite me. Likely I'll find some good in it, and I'll be very worried because it won't have gone far enough. That's my expectation. And I want to make it clear, Barack Obama's inaugural address worried me when I heard it back in 2008, 2009. It really worried me. Why? Because he talked about the challenges ahead and even made some references to what has happened in the American past. But he never really talked about, number one, what led us to the crisis to begin with. Okay. He did not, I'm not even saying he had to literally lambaste the Republicans, but he should have pointed a finger at the corporations that had driven us to that kind of inequality and to the banker, and he should have charged the bankers with having screwed us. And I say that because that's what FDR did when
Yeah.
he was inaugurated, to give
Right.
us a sense of direction. And I think he would have had a far more successful presidency if he had, one, done that, and two, then proceeded to engage American energies as opposed to just doing everything from the top down. Okay,
Mhm.
that's my feeling. So with Biden, I'm waiting to see, will he point a finger towards those we must beware?
Yep.
One. Two, will he talk about the imperative of engaging Americans in the reconstruction of the United States? Will he talk about empowering workers to be able to stand up to their employers who literally have gone out of their way to smash labor unions, to take back the benefits that were hard-won benefits of the post-war period, who have gone after the legacy of FDR such that we still do not have universal health care in this country? FDR wanted that, called for it a number of times. Okay, and in fact, well, I'll just stop there. So pay attention to the upcoming speech. That's important.
Awesome. Thank you very much.
Thank
I
you,
just want
Brady.
to give you this last little bit of time to plug whatever, your Twitter, you can plug your books. I think this book is great so far. I recommend
Oh, thanks,
everybody
thanks.
pick up this
Yeah, the one
book.
over my shoulder.
Yep,
Right,
over his shoulder.
right. Well,
And
that fight for the four freedoms was a love letter to my parents' generation for the struggles of the 30s and World War II, and the legacy of the kinds of things that their generation did enact in the 1960s, as when they were only in their 40s, these parents of mine, okay? But here's the other thing too. There was a prior book you mentioned, a book, Thomas Paine and the Promise of America. I could just show a picture, okay? That's my love letter to America, because it retells American history by way of the legacy of the radicalism of Thomas Paine and the generations upon generations of radicals who struggled to make Americans, to empower Americans basically with the promise of common sense and the Declaration. But I also want to say that my argument in the first book, the Thomas Paine book, not my first book, but the first book of these two that I wrote, was that Americans were turned into radicals by Thomas Paine and his words in 1776, and that those words and that impulse that he sort of implanted in Americans survives to this day. And the trick is for we who spread words today to remind Americans and to enable Americans to understand why it is that they don't like the way things are. There you go. I'll finish right there.
awesome. Well, thank you for coming on. Thank you for doing this. I really appreciate it. You've taught us a lot, and you give a lot of context when I ask these questions. You give a lot of background that leads up to it, which I think is really good and really important for people to understand. So I just wanted to say thank you for doing that. Please go pick up Harvey's book. Go follow him on Twitter as well.
Oh, right. Harvey J.K. on Twitter. Harvey, Harvey, initial J, Kaye. Thank you. I'm glad you mentioned that.
Yep,
And
awesome.
I also then want to
Oh,
say,
go ahead.
I want to compliment you on launching the podcast on this YouTube shows.
Thank you.
Okay. I don't know if people realize just how young you are.
Yeah,
Okay. More
yeah.
power to you is what I'll say. More power to you. Okay. And you and I, we know we'll stay in touch.
Yep.